Today is November 15th. Currently it's 12:30 around lunchtime, so your boy's starving. I'm trying to get a plate of pasta after this. But in today's video, we are going to be going over the disco headliners, how to play around the vertical, how to play around the different headliners that may be present in the game, and potential boards and compositions you can expect when playing around these units. Now, real quick, I know the title of the video is going to be titled Every Disco Headliner, but we actually won't be covering Nami and Carrick, but we will talk about them briefly for a little bit at the very beginning, but there isn't really any boards you can expect with these units, and more on that later. But first off, let's quickly go over the disco vertical and the units that you can expect in case you don't know anything about this tree. First off, we have Nami, who is our dazzler 1 cost, Tarek, our guardian, also a 1 cost, gragas, who is a spellweaver bruiser, so he actually has 3 different traits, along with disco, blitzcrank, our premier 4 cost tank of this vertical and also of the set. He's actually the strongest tank that you can get onto any board, so he's very tanky. I mean, with the exception of Lowy, but like very strong, like one of the most common units you'll probably see within the set, as well as our 4 costs carry of disco, Twisted Fate, who is also a dazzler. Very fun board to be playing around. You do get these disco balls, which unfortunately are jade statues with the icons based off tactics.tools, but you get little disco balls. The board basically plays out like jade. You surround your units around these disco balls, they get bonus stats. In the case as of right now, it is, I believe, scaling attack speed and healing, so you get extra attack speed, extra HP. So really fun board to play around, and it's actually very simple. Like I said before we start talking about our first actual headliner and potential composition you can play around, Tarek, Nami, we're not going to go over these because there's no real boards you can play around, but Tarek 2 as your headliner, at least in the early game, especially during stage 2, can be pretty strong and very beefy for your front line. So if you do find an early Tarek, I would say it's a cop. I think Guardians in general, I'm maybe a bit biased, but they feel the best to me in terms of the frontliners right now. But I know there is some argument to be made about maybe Cassandre being better, or maybe 2 Bruiser being better with TK. But I still think Tarek 2 is very solid. So if that is a potential headliner given to you, especially during stage 1, that is definitely a potential cop. Nami, on the other hand, I don't think I'd ever really pick up Nami headliner almost ever. The only exception I would ever make to this rule is if I got like Nami headliner and it was like +2 disco, and then I had like a bunch of disco units and I could like high roll disco into just like a vertical disco and tempo with it. That is like the only exception to the rule that I can ever think of, because Nami in general as a unit just feels really weak. It's just not really that great of a carry. The only exception to this is maybe if you have an Archangel Slam, and if the fight stalls out long enough, then she can start doing, decent amount of work. But in my experience, just trying to play Dazzlers in the early game or Nami in the early game without the Archangels just doesn't feel that good. But anyways, moving on to our actual first headliner of the set, or sorry, not of the set, of the vertical, is Gragas. Now, Gragas, I don't really see him being really that great with any other headliner except for Spellweaver. If you do find a Gragas too early though, again with headliner, he's great for tempo. So I actually really like Gragas headliner if you're like, hey, I just needed like a beefy frontline, and you just find it in your shop and boom, suddenly your frontline's super solid. But if you're trying to actually play him and like itemize him and play him as like a 3-star, I think Spellweaver is sort of the only one that really makes sense. The idea being is that you can reroll for both Gragas and for Seraphine within this board. Seraphine reroll has kind of popped up here and there, at least within our in-house lobbies, which by the way, if you want to come and watch some, high level PBE lobbies, you should come by the stream. It'd be pretty cool. It's GM plus. I'm actually the baseline, unfortunately. I'm on average probably the weakest player, which is funny. A lot of challenger players were participating. It's super dope. Sub-Zero's also there sometimes. Bro's like been late recently though. Not trying to call you out, but I'm just saying. But anyways, Sub-Zero, funny enough, he, speaking of which, actually played the Seraphine 3 line in one of our in-house lobbies and actually performed pretty well. So definitely consider playing this line. I think it's definitely something that you could consider. Obviously, this board also does fit on 6. You're rolling on 6 for this board. The only difference is that because it fits on 6 with an Ari, right, you would drop these 2 and you would play Ari instead. Ari being a 4 cost, not Akari, sorry. Ari. Ari being a 4 cost, very difficult to find, so you are probably just like sacking Bruiser until you find the Ari, because until then, it's probably, your board's probably gonna look something along the lines of, I believe it is, I am losing my train of thought, I apologize. Sometimes when you make these videos and you're like trying to think, and then you're like, hey, I'm like thinking, but like I didn't think all the way through, and then you're like, oh shit, how do I solve time while I'm trying to think about what I wanted to say? Shit happens sometimes, so that's a little too meta for me. But anyways, this is probably your board on 6, and then on 7, obviously, you just play the Bruiser. But Gragas 3 is actually pretty tanky as a unit. He actually heals for quite a bit based off his ability, which here, by the way, you can read it. He'll heal 650 HP with the current patch over 2 seconds and then deal some magic damage to adjacent enemies and actually chill them. So he actually has an attack speed slow built into his kit, which is super, super nice. You do kind of want to clump your front line here, especially because if you remember the advanced positioning guide from, I think, like a couple months ago at this point, we do have AoE from our backline with Seraphine, who just throws a little like a thingy and then it just does a bubble thingy. Anyways, you get the idea. It's AoE, all right? It's AoE. But a lot of really cool stuff. And Gragas, by the way, last thing before we move on to the next headliner, he just takes 8% less damage and deals 15% more damage. So his headliner effect is actually quite substantial, especially if you're playing around Gragas 3. So definitely try it out. I think it's a cool board. But like obviously, it's not a board I would say you would play very often. It's just if you happen to find a lot of Gragas as a Seraphine, then maybe it's something that you could lean towards. But again, it's not a line I would expect to see commonly, but who knows? Maybe in the future we'll see Seraphine and Gragas reroll becoming a lot more meta, because Seraphine reroll definitely was a menace, at least at the beginning of the PvE cycle. Moving on, Twisted Fate, our premier 4-cost carry. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to Twisted Fate. We're first going to talk about if you hit the Disco +2. Disco +2 basically just means you play vertically into Disco. It's probably the most consistent out of all the variations with Twisted Fate, at least with the current patch, but he is just a strong unit. His headliner effect, by the way, if you are unfamiliar, he just throws an extra 3 cards, and his ability, he just throws a shitload of cards divided between the current target and 3 nearest enemies. So he actually, based off the way that he may throw his cards, can actually hit the opponent's backline, and this is sort of where the strength of TF comes from, because there's not that much backline access, especially with the absence of assassins in the current set. So TF is actually one of those few units, with the exception of I think maybe Karthus and Akali, who actually has a decent amount of backline access. He actually gets to hit the backline quite a bit. In terms of itemization, we have talked about this before in the EDM video, because EDM Twisted Fate did come up very briefly, but Twisted Fate itemization is typically Shojin Archangels +1. A lot of people, especially myself included, when they first saw TF's ability, they kind of read this as like, oh, it's like AP attack speed, but no, he's just a caster. So Shojin's great, Archangels is great, especially because whenever you're playing Twisted Fate, typically the fights last a very long time, so he scales up quite a bit, and also just those bonus extra cards that end up like tickling the backline suddenly do a lot of damage because Archangels is scaling for the entire time. JG is fine, Gunblade is fine, any third item is okay. I don't really think you need healing, to be completely honest. Like, I don't think you need a Gunblade just because the disco balls will actually heal, right? In case you remember the way that the vertical works. He will heal a bit over time, so it's not necessary. You could have it, but I think they're definitely you just go Shojin +2 damage, and I think that's totally fine. Not much else to really talk about here. Blitzcrank, again, is going to be the main tank as well. You just itemize him with whatever is the tankiest items. By the way, please stop building gargoyles. The item is dog shit. I think at the beginning of the PvE, I was slamming gargoyles as like an example tank item. But as the PvE has progressed, this gargoyle item has really shown just how shitty it really is. So, oh, somebody is trying to get into the Discord. That's so funny. You can see at the bottom of the chat. But yeah, it's just not that good. But one last thing before we move on to the second variation of TF, I just do want to say that this board has a lot of potential to cap out. There is a lot of really strong units that you can play. Things like Ziggs, things like York for the Guardians, Alawi instead of the Zac for the Bruisers. You have a lot of potential to cap out this board. So this is probably one of... I think it's going to be the easiest vertical to play, at least with the current set, at least from what I can tell. It's just so straightforward. It's so easy to play. Your early game's a little weak sometimes, depending if you're like hard forcing this line or not. But as the game progresses and you just get more and more disco balls, you just start to slowly progress and you start to get really, really strong, especially once you hit 5 and 6 disco. So definitely a very, very fun line to be playing. Okay, so moving on into the second main line with Twisted Fate, which is +2 Dazzler. Now, this board is obviously going to be the higher cap of Twisted Fate, in my opinion. I mean, it depends on the numbers, right? You have 6 disco. If 6 disco is busted, and 6 disco is busted, and that's better. But right now, at least based off the meta, I believe people are playing 5 disco with +4 Dazzler, not 3. But the 4th is on 9, by the way. 4th is on 9. The reason being is that just because your front line is kind of weak if you end up playing 4 Dazzler instead. Like, this is just, you have Blitzcrank 2, and if that dies, everything falls over, which is kind of a problem. So I do think you just play 3 out of 4 Dazzler, and you just play the Alawi, or whatever bruiser you find, like Zac is fine as well. And even Guardian is fine. Like Thresh is fine here. Like that fits here into the board. Totally okay. You just fortify your front line a bit, and then on 9 you just get to tech in that 4th Dazzler. Really strong board. 4 Dazzler it just feels so much better than only just having 2, but nonetheless it's still a great board. Lulu, by the way, you might have noticed, is holding Shiv and red buff instead of Morello. This composition in particular, when it comes to anti-heal, I don't really think there's any unit that is like particularly that great when it comes to holding a Morello. Obviously, Morello and red buff are very, very similar. The only difference is that Morello gives like AP and then red buff gives attack speed. But because ideally you get a Shiv onto this Lulu here, red buff just works synergistically way better with Shiv than a Morello would. So the idea being it's just a lot of attack speed, just go pop, 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 right? And also red buff, for those of you who don't know, this procs on attacks and abilities. So red buff and Morello, they're basically the same item, which is one's attack speed, one's AP. So just keep that in mind. I think a lot of people, including myself, thought that red buff was only on autos and nothing else. But no, it works on abilities. So whenever Lulu casts her ability, every 3rd cast, stuns the 3 nearest enemies, she will proc red buff as well on that cast. So she's probably the best holder in my opinion. If you have a better opinion on it, then I would love to hear it. But that's just how I see it, at least right now. And again, it's just Ziggs on 9 for the 4 Dazzler, 2 Hyper Pop. Very, very strong board. The funny thing about Twisted Fate, though, as a Dazzler, is that he's actually also incredibly self-sufficient. Sorry. He's an incredibly self-sufficient carry, so you actually get to flex very, very easily in this board. So you don't even really need to play Disco at all. This is just one example. Like, quite honestly, I could take off all these units, and then we're chilling. Like, we just have a TF2, and then we just flex whatever the fuck we want. But you could also play into the Disco as well, and Blitzcrank, again, being the premier 4-cost tank of the entire set, it's very likely you'll find a blitzcrank anyways. And if you're going to find the blitzcrank and play it anyways, then you might as well play gragas for that 3 disco. And if you're going to play gragas for bruiser, you might as well play the Alawi. So that's kind of where this core comes from. But as you can probably tell on the left hand side, if you are a very good player, or maybe you're just very astute, this board just kind of plays itself out. So for example, Echo goes in here so that you can get the Sentinel, which is really nice for blitzcrank. But then, oh, what's this? We're 2 out of 3 spellweaver. What spellweaver could we put in? Oh, maybe we put in Lulu. Oh, really great. Then we get hyper pop and everything. But now we're missing 2 units. What could we use? Well, maybe an AD carry with, oh, what's this? True damage. Oh, that's really cool. And then suddenly, what's this? We need executioner for a Kali. Oh, what's that? Let's just tech in the executioner. Really, really cool. Just it does not matter. And suddenly we have a crazy fucking board for level 8. So this board, again, this is just what this tab is. It's basically the same thing. The board basically plays itself out if you end up playing this disco variation. But again, the core is just basically allowing blitzcrank, gragas, and Twisted Fate, and you can just flex whatever you want. But again, this is sort of like the easiest way to play about it, at least in my opinion. You can maybe do like TF Ari as well, depending on your items. I just think that having an AD carry as your tertiary, or your secondary carry rather, is really, really great. And then if you find a TG, just slam it on Karthus or whoever, does not fucking matter. But yeah, I just think that this board, it's probably pretty good. I haven't had a chance to test it out yet, but I would argue this is probably really good. It kind of depends on Akali, whether or not she's actually a unit or not. But I still think this is a pretty fine board to be playing and something you could definitely consider. One last thing, again, I briefly mentioned it. There is the 5 EDM TF board. I'm not going to go over it in this video because I believe we talked about it in the other video, in the EDM board, just because this does revolve around headliner Zac, not headliner TF, and Zac is an EDM unit. So if you want to go check that out, you can go check the last video. I believe we talked about it in there. Moving on is Blitzcrank +2 Disco. Now, +2 Disco with Blitzcrank basically means you're playing the Twisted Fate. You don't have to, but if you have AP items and you have the Blitzcrank chosen, you might as well just play the Twisted Fate. Again, assuming you have the AP items. It works very, very well because Twisted Fate is just like, you just get Twisted Fate and then you just get the Bard in here, which opens up Jazz, which is super nice. But then you also get the Mordekaiser in here for the +2 Sentinel, and you are chilling with a pretty decent board already. This is a very, very solid cluster that you can consider, and then you just keep flexing around the units afterwards. Just as an example, one board that you could potentially play is something like Twisted Fate with Ezreal as Big Shot. The idea being is that you're just playing +2 bruisers here just to fortify the front line a bit more, and then you just play the Misfortune Ezreal because it's just a nice synergy to have in the +2 in the backline, and it gives you an 80 potential secondary carry who can hold any 80 items you may find in case you find yourself with a lot of swords and a lot of like other damage items but you have nobody else to put them on. This is a very solid choice. Misfortune obviously is completing the Jazz tree for us, and we're chilling with a pretty solid board. Now obviously if you have +2 Disco with Blitzcrank and maybe you don't have AP items, you don't want to play into the TF, and that's totally okay. Another example that you can do is just play +3 disco here, and you just have the disco ball to just help fortify the front line. Obviously, Gragas is great for bruisers. That could eventually become an Alawi, and you flex whatever the fuck you want. You have 4 open slots to do whatever. 4 rapid fire, 4 big shot, 2 big shot, 3 spellweaver, because Gragas is a spellweaver, and that actually opens up the spellweaver tree. For example, like let's say Ari, you can do Ari Ezreal. That is totally fine, and actually it's actually kind of strong in my opinion. I'm trying to perfect the board, not to spoil my own tech, but I played this yesterday at like 1 HP, and I was like, oh, it's a fucking 8th, and then I think I salvaged like a 5th, because the board is like incredibly stable. You'd be kind of surprised. But this is also an example board that you could do. Makes a lot of sense. AD carry, AP carry, solid tank. Fits all the criteria we need for a fundamentally solid board. I don't see an issue with it. But maybe it's bad, and somebody can tell me I'm bad, and you know what, that's fine too. It is what it is. Finally, let's talk about blitzcrank sentinel. Now this is kind of funny. Yeah, that's it. Like blitzcrank, I would argue that this blitzcrank headliner as +2 sentinel is like inarguably the most flexible frontline that you could have. It's also the most solid. So for example, like you can make the argument like, yeah, like Thresh chosen, like, oh, but what if it's a headliner with +2 guardian? Ooh, what now? Ooh, well, I mean, like Thresh 2 versus blitzcrank 2, I mean, you want blitzcrank 2 every time. Plus it also buffs like the whole team. So it's just it's just so much tankier too, just based off his ability and the way that it works. So I would just say this is arguably the most flexible front line. So for example, let's say you're doing a level 8 roll down and you're like, I don't know what to put on my board. What do I do? If you find a +2 blitzcrank very early on, easy, insta take, and then you just play whatever the fuck you hit and then work it out. This is the most flexible, but it's also going to be probably the most skill expressive when it comes to your roll downs, because now it's not about your chosen, it's about, okay, what units am I playing around, what am I trying to build a board with? So really solid. That's basically all there is to it. But thank you guys for watching. I hope this was informative and helpful, and I will see you guys tomorrow for another video. Until then, I will take care, or sorry, you go take care, and have a good one. Take care, guys, and happy climbing.